Alrighty, let's get this over with. So if you're anything like me, you've saw this, and then saw the budget, and then saw this, and then saw the budget, and thought, I could do that in a week with zero budget. Turns out, terrible idea. So, equipped with my C- in art, I figured I'd start off with After Effects. That seems to be a pretty popular animation software for motion and that sort of thing, so I started off with that. Loaded up the new composition, drag and dropped my logo into the media folder, and then stared at it. Realized I couldn't do anything, even though I could in the top corner with all the tools there, so I instead installed Animate and dragged and dropped my logo in there. And in hindsight editing this, I realized I forgot to record the entirety of me explaining the software to you. Truly, this is only the kind of quality you can expect by the underqualified guy. So, this'll all be done in post, and let me give you a quick rundown of Adobe Animate. So the first thing you see when you launch the software is going to be this screen here. It looks a little overwhelming at first, but we really only are going to be using a couple things here. First off is going to be the selection tool. It's very self-explanatory, selects things. Next up, free transform tool. This is mainly going to be used to change any shapes, orientation, rotation, or scale. Next up is going to be the oval tool. It makes circles, and the rectangle tool, use your best guess. Lastly is going to be the pen tool that we're actually going to be using tool-wise. This is used in terms of paths to manipulate the shapes I'll be working with. You'll see a little bit better example of that early on, but that's basically it. Then there is the new layer, I guess button or widget. Shut up, Larry, no one cares. But most animation software across the board typically uses layers. It's rendered bottom up, so if you want the background layers, that's going to go on the bottom, and then the top layers are going to be your foreground. That's essentially just how layers work. You can just drag and slide them. Last thing I use is going to be these keyframes and blank frames. Keyframes are basically used to create motion. In traditional animation, I believe it's more so of the stop and start of a motion, but I don't really follow that because I only have a week. And then you have your insert blank frames. Those are just in between the motion. Right, so my first day, I made this circle that explodes outwards. What I essentially did was I had a logo symbolized by this text here in my post-production, and then I made shapes of all the individual components that I needed. From there, what I did is took the pen tool and dragged out the anchor points using control and drag. So when I finally had the shape mapped out the way I wanted, isolated into different keyframes, I added a couple of blank keyframes in between. Okay, yes, I realize those aren't blank keyframes, they're blank frames. But anyways, in between those, the two keyframes, after adding in the blank frames, I added in something called tweens, which basically automate, in some senses, the changing of either motions, shapes, or parents' faith in my continued existence. So just pick a spot, and then insert the tween you want. In my case, it's a shape tween, just because I'm modifying the pen paths of a shape. And if all goes according to plan, you'll end up with something like this. Going into the main animation itself, as you can see here, if I can zoom in, there you go. You can see sort of these little squares lining up around the circle. Those are the paths. And then all I would do is just drag them out to the corners and then erase a bunch of them to get me that nice quadrilateral, I think it's called. I don't know, trapezoid. And then expand it out to the screen. And that took me probably about 12 hours of my time. So on to day 2. So I figured separating out the logo into multiple different layers was probably the best decision. So the first thing I did day 3 was enter Photoshop with the original logo and start cutting out each of the individual components into their own PNG files. From there, I figured the first bit wasn't that hard to actually explain. All I did was separate out each of the individual components into layers into Animate using the Add Layer button earlier, and then from there, the pen tool became the bane of my existence and my best friend. First goal for me was getting this motion of the chair going nicely, so all it involved for the first day was selecting the individual shape after isolating the body parts into their own layers, isolating the shape, and then modifying the path. Add a new frame, and then add a new keyframe after that. I'm doing what's called animating in twos, where you have one keyframe, a blank frame, and then followed by another keyframe. It's meant to give off a certain style and a certain perception, but really, I'm just lazy and couldn't be bothered animating every single frame. So day 4 was much the same until I learned of the free transform tool. That basically allowed me to do rotation instead of just modifying the pen path before, and saved me a bunch of time working on the additional frames. Other than that, not really much to say, other than the fact that now the animation looks pretty sufficient, and it's basically done. So, what I then did was reopen Adobe After Effects, and then got to work there. So what I was thinking of is have the guy in the chair doing the pose, and then while he's doing his typing, or flailing his arms like a lunatic, he was going to have different icons of different pieces of software fly at him. So I just cut them out using screenshotting and Photoshop, dragged them all into my project window, and got ready to start up. It was already getting pretty late in the day, so all I decided to really do was set up the basis for the next day. So all I was going to do is drag and drop all of my images into where I needed them to go, and then I just move them around on the screen there to where I want them to be for when I start the animation. Which segues nicely into day 5. So day 5, I got the animation going for the icons and started looking about other things. But for the animation for After Effects, all you really need to do is click on the whatever layer you want, or whatever object in the layer you want. There's going to be a little expansion bar, and from there the options are nearly limitless. Like, I haven't even touched the surface of these things, but for what I'm just going to be doing, all I need access to is position. Shortcut to access to it is P, so you just click P, and then you'll notice a little stopwatch icon. You click that, and then that's going to be your first keyframe. All you have to do from there is drag the time bar over to wherever you want it to go, and then if you're adjusting position specifically, you can just drag the icon similar to the way I dragged them around in the first place, and it'll automatically add a keyframe and automatically add an animation, or put the frames in between to get the motion required. And after I added all the motions that I needed for it, I decided instead of having it so that they just fly across the screen, it was going to be more of a cyclone of apps around him, which then leads to him me face planting on my desk. So all I did was looked up a quick, really helpful tutorial on how to get orbits done, and got right to work. So the first thing I needed to do was set up a null object. Basically, a null object is just a placeholder that you typically attach other things to. So all I did was right click, and there was a create null option icon. It's pretty straightforward, and then I just shortened the time frame from there. Then what I did was I made sure to select all of the icons that I needed, and clicked this little button here that says 3D layer. What that basically allows me to do is work on a Z-axis, which is really important when I'm trying to have something rotate around something else. So just make them all 3D objects, and it allows me access to the Z-axis. If you do the same for the null layer and reselect all your icons, or all my icons, all I did was use the whip on one of the selected icons and attach it to my null layer. So what that then means is that the transform of all these little icons is going to be parented to the null object. So when the null object changes in scale, changes in position, changes in rotation, all of the sub-objects, meaning the icons, change with it. And since you don't see the null object at any point, all you see is the icons all behaving in sync, which in our case is really good to create the spiral. So with all that said, we just hit R to get access to the rotation of the null object, set our keyframes using the stopwatch like before, and you can see that it starts to rotate, but it doesn't rotate in the way we want, so we'll just have to figure something out. So, day 6. Only one more day left, so I had a lot to do and very little time to do it. A lot of it, unfortunately, was spent fiddling around with a lot of the components in order to get this little effect. And it involves nothing we don't already know about how to do. All I basically did was arrange it so that instead of them all coming into one center location, they were still all coming in to one central location, but in the meantime, the other components already in the circle would start rotating around to eventually create the circular shape you see here. Here's the problem. Getting the actual rotation right on the null object, because everything's still parented, was an absolute nightmare. Eventually I got it to work, but it was by no means pretty. And there still lies one issue that I will avoid addressing until the very end, because it turns out it wasn't addressed, even though I fully intended to. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. But with a little finagling and nothing we already didn't know, I just changed the rotation and orientation a bit of the null object, and from there just created some keyframes, moved it up and down while it was spinning, and it was all set to go. And that brings us to the final day of this torture experiment. A not so grand finale. Basically all I was going to do was have all the icons just blow up and come out of the screen a little bit, except it was abysmal, and let me show you why. So, first off, what I did was I stopped the null object from doing anything else, then increased its scale, which then increased the scale of every other item in the area. Then, from there, all it was just a matter of arranging different transforms, and then having them all drop down in the end. Took a lot of adjusting. And then there was this weird pathing thing where it automatically did weird arcs that I didn't want. So that was fantastic. But otherwise, that's pretty much all I did for that day. Except for the finale. What I did for that was I duplicated the original Adobe Animate clip, slid it to the very end, and then in time speed, just right click and then speed and time, all I did was set that to a negative value, and that basically does a reverse animation, which gives the nice effect of the final animation having the circle unfold, only to refold when it's over. So, in conclusion, can you make a perfectly solid animation within a week with a C- in elementary school art? The answer is absolutely. Because at the end of this all, even with all the pain, even with all the suffering, I still completely obliterated a $65 million budget.